For more than half a century, Jeannie Seely has been one of the Grand Ole Opry's sharpest voices. She isn't just a singer, she's a gatekeeper, a survivor, and one of the few who dared to challenge the Opry's rigid traditions. From the moment she walked on that stage in the late 1960s, she changed how women looked, sounded, and acted on country music's most hallowed ground. And she did it with wit, grit, and an unshakable sense of self. But behind the rhinestones and standing ovations, the Opry wasn't the warm, family-like place the public imagined. It was a battlefield. Generations clashed over image and sound. Veterans guarded their territory fiercely. Newcomers fought for airtime. And when the cameras stopped rolling, grudges were held in whispered conversations backstage, in dressing rooms, and on long Opry tours crisscrossing the country. Jeannie Seely didn't just live through those rivalries, she remembered them. She had 5 names that stood out above the rest, 5 stars, whose egos, attitudes, or actions left a mark she never forgot. Some were titans of tradition, others were fellow performers who crossed personal lines. But all of them, in their own way, collided with Jeannie Seely at the height of country music's golden age. Jeannie Seely's story begins far from the spotlight. Born in 1940 in Titusville, Pennsylvania, she grew up on the edge of the Appalachian world, surrounded by music that spoke to working people. She wasn't born into a Nashville dynasty or industry connections. She built her career the hard way, through relentless determination and a voice that carried both vulnerability and strength. In the early 1960s, Jeannie moved to California, chasing opportunity in the country music scene that was thriving along the West Coast. Unlike the polished Nashville sound dominating radio at the time, the California circuit favored grit. It valued individuality. Jeannie honed her craft there, performing in clubs, writing songs, and learning how to command an audience. Those years toughened her. By the time she returned east, she was no ingenue waiting for permission. She was a fully formed artist. Her breakthrough came in 1966 with the song Don't Touch Me. Written by Hank Cochran, it was a revelation. Jeannie's vocal delivery was raw, direct, and emotional, in a way that country audiences hadn't heard from a young woman in years. The single shot to #2 on the Billboard Country chart, earned her a Grammy, and opened the door to the Grand Ole Opry. But even then, she didn't fit the mold. When Jeannie stepped onto the Opry stage in her short skirts and high heels, she shocked the old guard. She looked modern, sounded unfiltered, and carried herself with a confidence that unsettled veterans who had grown accustomed to younger women deferring to them. But Jeannie wasn't interested in playing by those rules. She once said she didn't set out to change things, she just refused to apologize for who she was. That attitude would define her entire Opry career. Unlike many performers who orbited the institution, Jeannie rooted herself inside it. She joined the cast in 1967 and never left. Over the decades, she became both a performer and a cultural memory keeper. She watched generations rise and fade, yet she remained unafraid to speak bluntly about what happened behind the scenes. That bluntness earned her respect, but it also made her a lightning rod. Her career wasn't built on flawless public image, it was built on presence. When Jeannie walked backstage, people paid attention. She was quick with humor, but even quicker to call out arrogance or disrespect. She had seen too much to be intimidated. She knew which stars extended genuine kindness, and which ones carried grudges like armor. She didn't forget the slights, the whispered remarks, or the power plays that defined the Opry's backstage world. By the late 1960s and early 70s, Jeannie Seely had carved out a unique place, both insider and disruptor. She respected the Opry, but she never bowed to it. And in a building filled with towering personalities, that stance ensured that rivalries would follow. By the time Jeannie Seely joined the Grand Ole Opry in the late 1960s, the institution had already existed for more than 40 years. It wasn't simply a stage, it was a hierarchy. Veterans held power not through titles, but through tradition, seniority and influence with management. The structure was unwritten but deeply felt. Every artist who walked those halls understood it. For newcomers, the backstage world could be daunting. Dressing rooms weren't just places to prepare, they were territories. Performers formed clusters by generation, style and status. Older acts occupied the rooms closest to the stage. Younger singers learned quickly to wait their turn, sometimes for years. Every appearance, every slot on the running order was a negotiation between reverence and ambition, and if someone upset that balance, it didn't go unnoticed. The Opry was also a reflection of country music's larger cultural divide. In the 1950s, the institution was dominated by traditional string bands, mountain harmonies, and performers who had been part of the show since its early days. By the late 60s, a new generation was arriving. They were sharper, more modern, often influenced by West Coast country or pop production. They wore different clothes, spoke differently, and brought a confidence that clashed with the deference the veterans expected. Women faced an even steeper climb. Many of the Opry's early female performers had been presented as supporting figures rather than equals. Jeannie Seely, Connie Smith, Dolly Parton and others were part of a new wave who demanded to be treated as fully fledged stars. But backstage, some veterans resisted those shifts. They believed the Opry should remain as it had been, traditional, male-centered and slow to change. Tension built not in explosive confrontations but in countless small interactions: who spoke first, who interrupted, who was placed higher on the program. On top of this cultural friction was a unique power structure tied to airtime. Each Saturday night broadcast reached millions. Securing a better slot meant greater exposure, more bookings, and stronger record sales. Artists who consistently appeared later in the evening gained prestige. Those placed earlier were seen as lower on the hierarchy. Management often leaned on senior figures to decide who deserved which slots. That created quiet rivalries between artists who might never exchange harsh words on stage but competed fiercely off it. Jeannie Seely entered this system with neither seniority nor fear. She didn't apologize for her style. She didn't hide her ambition. She expected to be treated as a professional equal. That confidence, while admired by some, unsettled others who were accustomed to deference. And once those lines were drawn, they rarely faded. In the Opry's backstage world, disagreements weren't easily forgotten. They calcified into personal lists: who respected you, who dismissed you, and who you'd never forgive. For Jeannie Seely, 5 names would come to define those unspoken lists. They weren't random. Each represented a specific clash: tradition versus change, ego versus independence, loyalty versus control, charm versus disrespect, love versus fallout. Together they tell the story of how one woman navigated the sharp edges of country music's most powerful stage. Number 5. Roy Acuff. Roy Acuff was more than a performer. By the time Jeannie Seely joined the Grand Ole Opry, he was its living symbol. His career stretched back to the 1930s, when his fiddle tunes and heartfelt ballads transformed the Opry from a regional broadcast into a national institution. He had stood on the stage longer than almost anyone. Fans called him the king of country music. Inside the Opry, his presence carried quiet authority. When Roy spoke, people listened. When he frowned, careers could stall. Jeannie entered the Opry in 1967, at a moment when Roy's influence remained enormous. He wasn't part of management, but his opinions shaped the culture. He represented a generation that valued tradition above all else. Performers were expected to dress conservatively, behave respectfully, and present themselves in a way that upheld the Opry's image as a bastion of wholesome country values. Jeannie's arrival disrupted that rhythm. She didn't dress like the women Roy was used to. Her miniskirts, high heels, and stylish outfits reflected the cultural shifts sweeping through the 1960s. Audiences loved it. Older members didn't. Roy Acuff, in particular, viewed these changes with suspicion. He believed the Opry's integrity depended on holding the line against outside trends. To him, Jeannie's look and attitude represented a break from everything the Opry had stood for. Backstage, his disapproval wasn't whispered. Roy had a reputation for speaking his mind in plain language. He often challenged younger performers directly, sometimes during rehearsals, sometimes in hallways where others could hear. He wasn't cruel, but his authority made even a few words sting. Jeannie didn't wilt under pressure. She met his remarks with wit and composure. But those exchanges didn't disappear into the air. They lingered, shaping how others perceived her. The tension wasn't about personal animosity. It was about control of the narrative. Roy Acuff had spent decades protecting the Opry's traditions. Jeannie represented change he couldn't fully control. She wasn't alone. Dolly Parton and Connie Smith faced similar scrutiny. But Jeannie's sharp tongue and refusal to back down made her a particular lightning rod. She wouldn't soften her image to please the old guard. She wouldn't downplay her presence to avoid upsetting him. As the years passed, Jeannie's position solidified. She became a fixture, not a novelty. Roy's influence remained, but the cultural tide had shifted. Still, the early friction between them never disappeared completely. In interviews years later, Jeannie spoke candidly about the way older stars treated newcomers, not naming names, but describing moments of open disapproval. Roy's stance was part of that memory. He wasn't a villain in her story. He was a symbol of an older era colliding with a new one. Their dynamic captured a broader shift inside the Opry. Tradition meeting modernity head-on. And for Jeannie Seely, Roy Acuff stood at the center of that collision, shaping the atmosphere she would navigate for the rest of her career. Number 4. Wilma Lee Cooper. Wilma Lee Cooper was a formidable presence on the Grand Ole Opry long before Jeannie Seely arrived. Known for her commanding vocals and steadfast devotion to mountain music, she embodied the Opry's earliest sound. Alongside her husband, Stoney Cooper, she became a regular in the 1950s, carrying forward the high lonesome harmonies that had defined the show's rural identity. Audiences respected her. Fellow performers often treated her with caution. She was proud of her legacy and protective of her place within the institution. When Jeannie joined in the late 1960s, she represented a new wave of female performers who weren't content to stand quietly at the edge of the stage. Her wardrobe, stage presence, and modern sound contrasted sharply with Wilma Lee's traditional aesthetic. For Wilma, those differences weren't merely stylistic. They cut to the heart of what she believed the Opry should remain. She saw herself as a guardian of authenticity at a time when Nashville's sound was shifting toward polished production and commercial appeal. Backstage, generational lines among women were often as defined as those among men. Wilma Lee and her peers had spent decades carving out limited spaces for female performers, usually by accepting rigid roles within the male-dominated hierarchy. Jeannie and her contemporaries refused to do that. They demanded equal billing, independent artistic identities, and the right to break with convention. That divergence caused real friction, especially with women like Wilma, who believed the traditional path had to be preserved. The tension between Jeannie and Wilma wasn't the stuff of public feuds or headlines. It unfolded in the quiet spaces behind the stage curtain. Dressing room conversations carried an edge. Order on the program became a subtle power play. Veteran women like Wilma expected younger performers to wait patiently for years before receiving prime slots. Jeannie, armed with a Grammy-winning hit and growing popularity, quickly bypassed some of those unspoken steps. To Wilma, that leap felt like a breach of protocol. Wilma Lee also held deep personal convictions about modesty and presentation. Jeannie's appearance challenged those ideals directly. The miniskirts and glamorous styling weren't just a fashion statement, they signaled independence. For Wilma, who had built her reputation within a more conservative framework, this was unsettling. Her reaction wasn't explosive, but it was firm. She let her disapproval be known in small, cutting remarks and cool exchanges. Jeannie, never one to back down, didn't seek her approval. Their rivalry reflected a broader tension among female performers of different generations. Wilma represented tradition, discipline, and deference to the Opry's established ways. Jeannie embodied a new era of women who refused to blend into the background. Neither was wrong. Both were shaped by the eras that produced them, but their coexistence in the same narrow backstage corridors created an undeniable friction. Over time, Jeannie's position at the Opry solidified, while Wilma Lee's role became more symbolic. Their interactions softened, but never became warm. The early years left their mark. To Jeannie, Wilma wasn't an enemy. She was a reminder of the gatekeeping women also faced, not just from men, but from each other. It was a rivalry born not of malice, but of two powerful women standing on opposite sides of a cultural divide. Number 3. Webb Pierce. By the time Jeannie Seely arrived at the Grand Ole Opry, Webb Pierce's name carried both glory and controversy. In the 1950s, he was one of the biggest stars in country music. His string of hits from There Stands the Glass to I Ain't Never dominated the charts. He sold more records in that decade than almost anyone. He drove flashy cars, wore rhinestone suits brighter than stage lights, and built a mansion in Nashville with a guitar-shaped swimming pool. Webb wasn't subtle. He wanted everyone to know he was a star. But his relationship with the Opry had fractured long before Jeannie stepped onto that stage. Webb had refused to play by the Opry's rules, often prioritizing touring and lucrative personal appearances over his Saturday night commitments. Management saw this as betrayal. Many performers who stayed loyal to the show viewed him with resentment. Though he technically remained part of the country music establishment, Webb was an outsider inside his own industry by the late 1960s. Jeannie's career rose during this uneasy period. She joined an Opry community that still carried scars from Webb's clashes with leadership. His presence backstage wasn't frequent, but when it happened, it stirred tension. He was opinionated, proud, and unwilling to acknowledge the authority of those who'd stayed behind when he broke ranks. Younger performers like Jeannie entered this environment with fresh momentum, quickly earning coveted slots he had once dominated. For someone with Webb's ego, watching a new generation thrive inside an institution he had openly defied was a bitter experience. Their friction didn't grow from direct personal insult. It came from their positions within the Opry's unwritten social map. Jeannie represented loyalty, regular appearances, and integration into the Opry's evolving culture. Webb symbolized rebellion against that very structure. His reputation for arrogance followed him wherever he went. Many artists described him as charming one moment and dismissive the next. Jeannie had little patience for performers who expected reverence without showing respect. Her bluntness and independence clashed with Webb's self-importance. When Webb appeared backstage, his interactions were marked by a certain edge. He was older, set in his ways, unimpressed by the new wave. Jeannie, far from deferential, treated him as a peer rather than a legend. In the Opry's rigid hierarchy, that was a bold stance. Webb didn't forget slights, real or imagined. He carried grudges with theatrical flair, often turning small encounters into lasting impressions. Jeannie wasn't intimidated. She met him on equal footing, which only deepened the unspoken rivalry between them. Their dynamic symbolized the tension between two archetypes within country music: the fading superstar who refused to adapt, and the rising insider determined to shape the institution's future. Webb's influence declined through the 70s, while Jeannie's presence endured. The divide between them remained part of the Opry's backstage memory, a reminder that egos didn't have to collide publicly to leave lasting marks. For Jeannie, Webb Pierce represented a kind of arrogance she never accepted. She respected talent, but not entitlement. Their uneasy encounters stood out, not because of shouting matches, but because both personalities refused to bend. Number 2. Faron Young. Faron Young was one of country music's most charismatic stars. But behind the charm was a reputation that divided people. Known as the hillbilly heartthrob, he rose to fame in the 1950s with a string of hits that made him a household name. Songs like Live Fast, Love Hard, Die Young defined an image that was both rebellious and magnetic. By the time Jeannie Seely joined the Opry, Faron was already a seasoned headliner. He had the swagger of someone who had spent years at the top, and he knew it. Backstage, Faron's personality dominated. He was quick with jokes, always at the center of a crowd, and known for his sharp tongue. Many found him entertaining, others found him exhausting. He had a habit of pushing boundaries, especially with younger female performers. His teasing often crossed into remarks that today would be considered openly disrespectful. At the time, they were brushed off as part of his persona, but Jeannie Seely wasn't someone who let such behavior slide. Unlike some newcomers who avoided confrontation, she met his words head-on. She had spent years navigating male-dominated spaces and knew how to protect herself without flinching. When Faron made cutting or suggestive remarks, Jeannie answered back with equal sharpness. Her refusal to play the role of a passive target stood out. In a backstage culture that often rewarded silence, her quick wit disrupted the power dynamic he expected to control. Their friction wasn't about music, it was about respect. Faron was used to holding court. He enjoyed watching younger singers squirm under his teasing. Jeannie didn't give him that satisfaction. Their exchanges became part of Opry lore, not public scandals but whispered stories about the woman who refused to let Faron get the last word. Some admired her for it. Others warned that pushing back against someone as established as Faron could make life difficult. Faron's temper was as famous as his humor. If he felt slighted, he remembered it. Over time, the tension between them grew less playful and more pointed. Jeannie's rise coincided with a period when Faron's personal struggles began affecting his career. He drank heavily, became unpredictable, and clashed with colleagues more frequently. In that environment, Jeannie's presence as an unyielding peer challenged his sense of dominance. He didn't control the narrative when she was in the room. Their dynamic reflected a larger pattern in the Opry's backstage world. Women asserting boundaries in spaces long shaped by unchecked male behavior. Faron wasn't unique in his attitude, but he was emblematic of it. Jeannie's interactions with him stood out because she didn't retreat. She didn't smooth over his remarks to keep the peace. She held her ground and in doing so made it clear that respect wasn't negotiable. As the years passed, Faron's star dimmed. His behavior became more erratic, and the Opry slowly evolved past the era that had given him so much power. Jeannie remained steady and outspoken. Her memories of those years included plenty of warmth for the artists she admired. Faron Young wasn't one of them. To her, he represented a time when talent excused arrogance, a time she refused to accept on anyone's terms but her own. Number 1. Bill Anderson. Bill Anderson's connection to Jeannie Seely was unlike any of the others. He wasn't just a colleague on the Opry stage, he was a partner, both professionally and personally. Known as Whisperin' Bill for his soft conversational singing style, he had already established himself as a songwriter of rare skill by the time Jeannie emerged in Nashville. His compositions were hits for other artists as well as for himself, and his reputation for elegance and emotional depth made him one of the most respected figures of his generation. Their paths intertwined quickly. In the late 1960s, Jeannie and Bill recorded duets, toured together, and developed a close personal bond. On stage, their chemistry was undeniable. Off stage, it grew into a romantic relationship that lasted several years. They shared hotel buses, backstage dressing rooms, and the constant rhythm of Opry tours. For a time, their partnership symbolized a new kind of pairing, two independent stars combining their talents without one overshadowing the other. But close bonds within the music world rarely stay untouched by ambition, ego, and circumstance. Both were strong personalities. Jeannie was outspoken, quick-witted, and unafraid to challenge expectations. Bill was thoughtful, but used to being the calm center of attention. As their careers evolved, differences surfaced. Touring schedules, artistic decisions, and the intensity of life on the road created strain. Their personal relationship began to mirror the shifting dynamics of their professional one. When their romance ended, it didn't dissolve quietly. They continued to see each other constantly through the Opry, shared bills and industry events. Every encounter carried a mix of respect, history, and unresolved tension. Unlike the other figures on Jeannie's list, Bill's name wasn't tied to power struggles or backstage disrespect. It was tied to emotional fallout, the kind that lingers long after formal ties are cut. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses too well to keep things completely neutral. Jeannie never publicly disparaged Bill, nor did he attack her. But behind closed doors, their separation left a mark. Mutual friends often felt the temperature in the room shift when they were together. Collaborations became less frequent. What had once been an easy dynamic turned careful, measured. The warmth of their early partnership cooled into a wary coexistence. Their complicated history wasn't about betrayal or scandal. It was about two careers colliding under the weight of proximity and personality. Jeannie's inclusion of Bill on her private list wasn't born of hatred in the way her clashes with others were. It came from the pain of a bond that couldn't survive the pressures of the Opry and the road. For someone as fiercely independent as Jeannie, that kind of fracture cut deeply. Even after their romantic relationship ended, they remained part of the same institution. Each carved separate legacies within the same walls. Their story stood apart from her other rivalries because it wasn't about dominance or disrespect. It was about love, disappointment, and the permanence of shared history. Shaped by confrontation, resilience, and an unwavering belief in her place on that stage, she navigated a world ruled by tradition and ego, holding her ground against titans like Roy Acuff, clashing with proud traditionalists like Wilma Lee Cooper, standing toe-to-toe with figures such as Webb and Faron, and weathering the complicated aftermath of her bond with Bill Anderson. Each name carried a different kind of tension, institutional, cultural, personal, or emotional. But together they traced the story of a woman who refused to bend. Through every rivalry, Jeannie remained. She became not just a performer but a constant presence, outlasting many of the very figures who challenged her. Her story isn't one of bitterness. It's a record of survival inside an environment that tested every artist who stepped through its backstage doors. She didn't forget the conflicts. She absorbed them, learned from them, and kept singing. For more emotional stories, check out this video.